Welcome back, listeners. Today we're diving deep into the world of, well, the X-Files, of course. And specifically, we're going to take a closer look at the Season 2, Episode 3.
Oh, 3, yeah. It's an interesting one, that's for sure.
You guys have shared some really fascinating thoughts and memories about this one. So, yeah, let's get right to it.
Okay.
This episode stands out because it's Scullyless, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after her abduction, Mulder's left to handle this really strange case in L.A. all on his own. A pretty lonely situation for him, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a unique episode in that sense. It really highlights how much Mulder relies on Scully, I think.
Right, exactly. We see a very different side of him. So in this deep dive, we're going to break down what happens in this case, see where it leads Mulder, and maybe find out if it has any kind of deeper meaning for the whole series. I mean, it's interesting to point out that this is the only episode in the first 7 seasons without Scully.
You're right. Yeah, that's pretty significant. And I think it's also worth mentioning that, even though 3 is like a standalone episode, a monster of the week kind of thing, it still gives us a lot of insight into who Mulder is. And also, it explores some pretty creaky themes, like the occult and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so the episode starts off with this really disturbing scene. We're in Los Angeles, and this businessman, Garrett Lohr, is in his hot tub with a woman, and then 2 other guys show up. And it gets really violent, really fast.
Yeah, they end up, they drink his blood.
Yeah, it's pretty graphic. And they use these hypodermic needles, too. But it sets a very dark tone right from the beginning.
It definitely suggests that we're not dealing with, your average criminals here. The whole blood drinking thing, the fact that there are 3 of them, it feels ritualistic, like some kind of ancient belief or something.
Yeah, there's definitely something more going on. So Mulder gets to L.A., and it's almost like a symbolic gesture, but he goes to his old X-Files office. It's been closed down, of course. But he goes there and takes Scully's badge and glasses and puts them in a file with her name on it.
That's a really powerful moment, I think. Even though the X-Files has been shut down and Scully's missing, Mulder's still holding on to that connection.
Yeah, it's like he's keeping her memory alive in a way.
Yeah.
And then he goes to the crime scene, and right away, he starts putting the pieces together. He finds out there have been 6 similar murders in 2 different states, and all of them involve draining the victim's blood, smashing mirrors, and writing biblical passages in blood. That's when he comes up with the idea of this unholy trinity.
Yeah, the whole thing just screams ritualistic, doesn't it? The smashed mirrors, the biblical passages, it's like they're trying to send a message or something.
Yeah, definitely. So Mulder gets a tip about this guy, Frank, who's the new night watchman at a blood bank. And when he goes to investigate, he finds Frank in the storeroom. And, well, let's just say he's not exactly following proper blood bank procedures.
Right. And when they question him, Frank claims to be a vampire. And not just any vampire, but part of this trio, the Father, the Son, and the Unholy Spirit. They're all looking for immortality, he says.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild claim, even for Mulder. And at first, he's actually kind of skeptical.
Yeah, that's surprising, considering how open he usually is to, the paranormal.
I know, right? But then, things get really weird. Frank freaks out when they shine a red light on him.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and then, as the sun rises, Frank, he spontaneously combusts. Right there in the interrogation room.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty convincing evidence, I'd say. I mean, the whole vulnerability to sunlight thing is like a classic vampire trait. So for Mulder, witnessing that must have been, pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that he's no longer skeptical at this point. So they find a tattoo on Frank's body. It's the symbol for this club called Club Tuppis.
Like Vlad Tepes' Dracula.
Exactly. So Mulder goes undercover to this vampire club. And that's where he meets Kristen Kilar. What do you think of that whole scene?
It's pretty creepy, right? It's like, is it all just pretend or is there something more to it? And Kristen, she doesn't have a reflection.
Right, classic vampire stuff. And their conversation is full of these like cryptic hints and allusions. And Kristen even finishes a biblical quote that Mulder starts. It's like they're speaking in code or something.
Yeah, it's clear they're both in the know, so to speak.
Right. Then Mulder sees Kristen leaving with this guy, David Young. And he tries to stop them, but he ends up getting beaten up.
Oh, right.
And later, Young and found murdered. And guess who the prime suspects are?
The other 2 vampires?
Yep. So Mulder looks into Kristen's background, and he finds out that she used to live in Portland and Memphis. And And guess where those other murders happen?
No way.
Yeah. So now it's looking like Kristen might actually be the unholy spirit.
That geographic connection is pretty damning.
Right. So they search Kristen's house and find all this like blood-related stuff. And when she gets back, Mulder confronts her. And she tells him this really disturbing story about how she met the son, whose real name is John, in Chicago. And how they used to do these, what she calls blood sports together.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. It's a pretty messed up concept.
Yeah. She says she ran away when John started the unholy trinity and their killing spree, but they're still after her.
So she's trying to make herself out to be the victim here.
Yeah, but her past actions kind of complicate that narrative. Anyway, there's this really interesting moment where Kristen sees Scully's cross necklace, and they kind of share this unspoken understanding about loss.
Right. It's a brief moment of connection between them amidst all this darkness.
And then Mulder tells her that John is dead. But she doesn't seem all that relieved.
Yeah, there's definitely something more going on there. Like maybe she's still afraid of the other vampire, or maybe she had feelings for John, you know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's really ambiguous.
Yeah.
And then, well, things get even more complicated. Mulder and Kristen, they share a kiss. It's a pretty charged scene.
Yeah, and it all happens while John, who's not actually dead, is watching them.
Right. So John confronts Kristen and tells her to kill Mulder as a test of loyalty.
Yeah.
And at first it seems like she's going to do it. She comes at Mulder with a knife.
Oh, right, yeah.
But then she turns and stabs the father instead.
It's a pretty shocking twist.
Yeah. So then there's this big fight and Mulder manages to tie up John and they try to escape. But then the unholy spirit attacks them.
Right, and Kristen ends up running them over with the car.
Yeah, it's really violent. And then in this final act of defiance, she drives back to the house, pours gasoline all over it, and sets it on fire with herself and John inside.
Wow, it's a tragic end, but I guess in a way she finds freedom, you know?
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated resolution. So the episode ends with Mulder standing there holding Scully's cross as the house burns down.
It's a haunting image, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So now let's step back a bit and take a look behind the scenes of this episode. There's some really interesting stuff going on there too.
Yeah, especially considering the whole, Scully being absent thing.
Exactly. This episode was made because Gillian Anderson was on maternity leave after having her daughter, Piper.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's the only time in the first 7 seasons that Scully isn't in an episode at all. It wasn't until season 8, after David Duchovny left the show, that they had another episode completely without Scully.
So, it's kind of a unique moment in the show's history, born out of, real life circumstances.
And it turns out that David Duchovny actually had a lot of input on the direction of the episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah, apparently the original idea was to focus more on Mulder's grief over Scully's abduction. But Duchovny wanted to make it more of a, vampire thriller.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's cool to see how the actors can sometimes influence the stories they're telling.
It shows how much they care about their characters,
Yeah, definitely. So the character of Kristen Kilar was actually inspired by Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles books.
Oh, that makes sense. There are definitely some similarities there.
Yeah, like the whole tragic romance angle and the connection to a trio of vampires. And speaking of the production, well, because they had to write and film this episode really quickly to work around Gillian Anderson's absence, there are a few plot holes. And the fan reaction was a bit mixed.
Yeah, it's understandable. When you have to rush things, sometimes the quality suffers a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, and the title 3 is actually a pretty straightforward reference to the 3 vampires.
John, Kristen, and the son.
Yep. And here's a fun fact. The actor who played the son, Frank Cassini, he actually shows up later in a different role in the season 4 episode Tunguska. He plays a Russian prison guard.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of cool how they bring back actors for different parts sometimes.
It adds another layer to the whole viewing experience,
Yeah, for sure. And one more behind-the-scenes tidbit. The big fire at the end of the episode, that was all done with practical effects.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no CGI or anything. They used some really clever editing and lighting tricks to make it look real.
That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it really adds to the intensity of the scene. So, getting back to the story itself, there was a lot of discussion among fans about Mulder's relationship with Kristen. Some people thought it was really out of character, especially since Scully had just been abducted.
Yeah, I can see why people would think that.
But others saw it as, a way of him dealing with his grief and loneliness. It definitely sparked a lot of debate.
I think it just goes to show how invested people were in Mulder and Scully's relationship. any kind of deviation from that was bound to get a reaction.
And believe it or not, even Chris Carter, the creator of the show, wasn't a big fan of this episode.
Really?
Yeah, he said that he considers it one of the weaker episodes from that season.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I guess even the creators don't always love everything they make. So even though there were other vampire-themed episodes in later seasons, 3 was actually the first one to explore that kind of lore.
Right.
And it kind of leaves it open to interpretation whether the unholy trinity were really vampires or just a really messed up cult.
That ambiguity is one of the things that makes the X-Files so great, you know? You're never quite sure what to believe.
Yeah, it keeps you guessing. So to wrap things up, 3 is a really unique episode. It's the only one in the first 7 seasons where Scully is totally absent, and it deals with some pretty dark themes.
And it has a really interesting behind-the-scenes story, too.
Yeah, definitely. So here's something to think about. Knowing how devastated Mulder was about Scully's abduction, and then experiencing this intense but ultimately tragic connection with Kristen, do you think that changed his perspective at all? Not just about the paranormal, but about his partnership with Scully. And, on a broader level, what do you think this episode says about how people deal with grief and loneliness? It's definitely something to ponder. Anyway, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
And we'll see you next time.